O morena tātou, ka nui te mihi kia tātou kua whakarauika mai I runga I te karanga o te kaupapa me ki. Ka nui te mihi kia koutou katoa. E oku me ki, taku iti e taku rahi, tēnei te mihi a te Aotearoa taranaki whānui kia koutou, ana kua riro māku hei whakatūwhera tā tātou hui ki te karakia. Nā reira kia taunga manaakitanga te mea ngaro ki runga ki tēnā o tātou. Kia māhea te hua mā kihi kia toi te kupu, toi te mana, toi te aroha, toi te reo Māori, kia tūturu ka whakamaua kia tīnā.
Tīnā.
Aunge, hui e, tā iki e,
Okay.
ora tātou. Kei a koe Māui.
Ora, awa kia ora koutou. Tēnei no te miki kā koe hauru, no ngā karaki wa wāhi tēnei o ngā kaupapa mo tēnei ata. O tira kia koutou katoa, I ngā mana I ngā reo, whakarauika mai rungi tēnei kaupapa, te karanga o tēnei kaupapa, me ngā upoko, ngā mātanga, ngā pūkenga, ko tau mai tēnei rā, hei whāngai o rātou mōhiotanga kia tātou, rea tēnā tātou. Yeah, look, welcome to this Wānanga around data governance and data sovereignty. It's great to have so many people interested in the kaupapa. And to give a little bit of a starter for the project generally, I'm just going to hand it over to Manpreet. So kia ora, Manpreet.
Kia ora Māui, no mai haere mai ki te whananga whakamutunga, ki te huinga I ra taketake o Aotearoa, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everyone to the final Wānanga in this Wānanga series for the National Science Challenge project to build a Te Tiriti-guided national reference barcode library. And the main goal of this program has been to develop advice and a business case to the government on the process of generating a national resource. And as some of you have been regular attendees, as you know, we've explored a number of issues and topics that are of relevance to developing a Te Tiriti-guided framework for such a project. I will give a little brief summary of the progress so far at the end of this Wānanga to keep everyone posted, as well as the next steps towards the end. But before we kick in, I just wanted to thank both of our co-facilitators to coming online and all of our speakers for giving up some precious time to put this together. So thanks, and I'll pass on to Māui to start the session off.
Kia ora no. Thanks for that, Manpreet. So yeah, so just an outline of how the session is going to run today. We've got three fantastic speakers here, experts nationally and internationally in this kind of area. So Valence Smith, Tahu Kukukai and Linnell Tawhiri-Huria. Myself and Holden will also provide a bit of an outline of some other sort of aligned projects that have been that contribute into thinking into the space as well. But essentially after those talks come about, then we'll have a Q&A session, which Holden will facilitate. If I just let people know as the talks are going, feel free to add your questions into the chat and we'll collect those and they'll inform the Q&A session in the second part of the hui. So with that, I'll just hand the time over to Valence to introduce yourself and share your whakaaro. Kia ora.
Tuatahi ake. First and foremost, can everyone see the first slide?
Hi.
Okay, so technology is working. Hoi no te whānau, wa tuatahi ake mihi ana ki a koe te tuakana nau I whakatūwhara. Tēnei noho tahi o tātou I raro I te tauwharo o te wāhi ngaro. Nō reira kei te mihi. O te rā ki a koutou e whakahaere I tēnei kaupapa e mihi ana. Tātura ki a rātou, kua whetūrangitia, haere ngā mate, haere au tū rā, moe mai rā, oki ai, hoatu. Rātou ki a rātou, tātou te hunga ore ki a tātou. Nō reira te ti e te tai mai a koe rangatira, e ngā mane, ngā reo. I runga I ngā huatanga o te wā me te ngā kauwhakaiti, nei ka mihi. Ki tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Ko ai au, taku pāpā no Ngāpohi, te parawhau, te ururoroi, te mahurihuri ki whatutiri, taku māma no tēnei pikitia. Ko taniwha te marae, ko taupuri te maunga waikato te awa, waikato te iwi Ngāti Mahu te hapu. Nō reira ko tainui tēnei e mihi nei, he tangi nei ki tēnā ki tēnā koutou. Kia ora mōrena te whānau. Thank you to everyone who's participated in this kaupapa, in this wānanga, in this robust discussion. And thank you to also the organisers, indeed our tuakana, for opening us up with karakia to ensure that we have safe passage with our discussions that we're about to have. Ahoi no, ka mutu ki kona, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. The name of this presentation is When the Crown Controls Mātauranga, and I'll just give a bit of a background before I actually get into it. So this is a report that was written and led by Aroha Mead, and she had a group of us, and we're called Te Aho Mātauranga, and we're just a group of Māori academics within the National Science Challenge, and we came together to explore different kaupapa important to us, and indeed the Y262 is important to us. And so I want to acknowledge Aroha Mead at this time. She led everything, this is also a part of I suppose a snapshot of a presentation that we presented earlier in June. I also want to acknowledge Jamie Ataria, Te Puawai Wilson Lee, who did an amazing job at collecting all the data for us. Sean Ogilvie, Irina Watina Raweri, Helen Potter, and Marcus Shadbolt. And so that's our team. And what we're going to discuss today is what is the report. I'm going to assume that no one's read the report. So I'm just going to pull out some of the early learnings from our analysis, the key messages from our Crown agencies, and why Māori control is important. Again, if you want a fuller understanding of this report, I invite you to go to the Biological Heritage website. Just type in When the Crown Controls Mātauranga, and I'm sure our webinar will pop up there. So what is the report? The report is a response to Ko Aotearoa tēnei. So it's been 11 years since the publication of Ko Aotearoa tēnei, and just a bit of context on that, it's a report by the Waitangi Tribunal addressing the Y262 claim, which focused on laws and policies that had detrimental effects on Māori culture, on identity, on Mātauranga Māori. So the tribunal observed that to some extent, virtually every government agency involved in the tribunal's inquiry interacted with Mātauranga Māori to some extent. And so in the room, in our virtual room, I'm sure there are whānau from the government agencies wanting to, that have had interactions with Mātauranga Māori, with kaitiaki, with Māori community. So I invite you to go into this discussion with those experiences as well, because I think it's about bringing those experiences into a cope like this, where things actually start to click. So positionality is really key here. So yeah, again, I invite you to bring all of your experiences within this kaupapa into this space. So Ko Aotearoa tēnei, just context, is made up of 8 chapters. And one of the chapters, chapter 6, is When the Crown Controls Mātauranga Māori. And so that's where the name of our report comes from. And in chapter 6 of When the Crown Controls Mātauranga, the Crown had, the chapter 6 argued that the Crown had deliberately harmed Mātauranga Māori and its traditional knowledge transmission systems. Again, going back to my previous slide, it did state that every Crown agency that appeared in our inquiry, and most of those that did not, deals with Mātauranga to some extent. At the centre of this harm is the finding that the Crown is practically in the seat of kaitiaki, as some agencies are custodians of mātauranga. Some of its owners, others fund it, while others are responsible for transmitting it. So at that time, and indeed now, that's still a bit confronting. You know, that is the reality, and difficult to reconcile. So the notion of the Crown described as kaitiaki, with my understanding of what kaitiaki are, is inconsistent. And so it's very unsettling. And indeed, I share the sentiments of everyone of our rōpū te aho mātauranga who contributed to this kaupapa. Because it's problematic, and hopefully by the end of this little session, you'll understand why. I can just introduce one part, which is, you know, we talk about mātauranga Māori. Irrespective of mātauranga Māori being a new introduced word to our lexicon, only in the last 180 years. If we narrow that down to a regional or localized context, we have mātauranga a iwi, and mātauranga a Ngāti Whātua, mātauranga a Waikato, mātauranga a Ngāti Mahuta. And so therefore the considerations of those regional contexts, those hapu, whānau contexts, and as the Crown being kaitiaki of those things and of that domain, again, is problematic and unsettling. Okay, so what the report is it's a questionnaire, and not so much an analysis of each part of the questionnaire, but just to get a big picture idea or a map of what's happening across Crown activities. So a questionnaire was sent out to 32 Crown departments, ministries, what are we, two years ago. So this is a 2-year journey, actually 3 years. There were 6 questions left to departments to respond as they deemed appropriate. Those queries pertain to their policies, legislation, funding, management, and I'm going to show you a little table outlining these different areas. So management, assessment of, and broader impact of mātauranga. So in the end, we received responses from 29 agencies, with an additional 3 agencies included in the responses. So a total of 84%, which we thought was awesome. So of those 29 agencies, and if you're in the room, and if you know that you did respond, me pēhea rā te kōrero nei rā taku mihi kia koutou katoa. Thank you for being a part of our kaupapa, of this kaupapa, of our kaupapa. Information and data like this is necessary in order for us to make data-informed decisions. So, e mihi ana kia koutou. When we received the analysis part of things, we went as vigorously and robust as we could and did 3 rounds of analysis of the responses to double check, to verify accuracy. Just to, again, dot the I's, cross the T's, all the above, just to ensure that our report held as much water as possible. Noteworthy to mention is that of the requests that we asked for, contributions to our survey, 5 agencies did not respond. And this is not a name and shame. I'm just letting everyone know that some of our agencies did not respond for whatever reason. Department of Conservation, Ministry for Pacific Peoples, New Zealand Customs Service, Oranga, Tama Raiki, that's Tamariki, and the Serious Fraud Office. So now basically going back to what is the report. So the information contained in this report was obtained directly from, again, government departments in response to the questionnaire. It's a comprehensive overview of Crown activities relevant to mātauranga as identified and described by them. So, you know, also understand that the questionnaire was a self-assessment. And again, the intention of the report was to develop a picture of activities. And so from that understanding, a self-assessment we thought was appropriate. So we're not there to, again, judge or analyse localised activities, but rather analyse the broader picture. And really to ask the question, has there been any progress since the last 30 years, since the Tribunal's report was released? Does the Crown now have an overarching policy in its role, vision and objectives relating to Mātauranga, which was one of the recommendations from Ko Aotearoa tēnei, which is what is that overarching policy to protect Mātauranga, to protect kaitiaki, to protect our communities. And we'll have a look at some of those discussions. So the early learnings are there. The Crown does not control Mātauranga, but it does exhibit controlling behaviour relating to Mātauranga in some instances. And in the report itself, it does highlight or provide examples of that. Is there a whole of government approach? No, and that's problematic. So no evidence of a central whole of government approach to the policy for Mātauranga. Department level, the majority of government departments do not have policies in place to guide their interaction with Mātauranga. And that's really, again, concerning, given that it is a taonga. You know, if we wanted to cast the lens of Te Tiriti-guided, you know, active protection, Article 2. And yet, despite lack of policies and legislation, agencies continue to initiate and undertake a wide range of initiatives. And this is not to discourage activity with Mātauranga, indeed with Māori communities, but we have to have a shared understanding and shared vision of what that looks like. An overarching policy to keep everybody safe is required. And that was, again, one of the recommendations from Ko Aotearoa tēnei. So there is no overarching policy, which means there's a whole lot of silos, and more importantly, these silos are disconnected, and there's no orchestrated approach to ensure that Mātauranga Māori is protected. The last point, there are a few legislative protections in place relating to Mātauranga, and none that specifically cover a protection from misappropriation. And there might be some whānau in the audience that have experienced that, that have experienced our Mātauranga, and I'm going to put Mātauranga in another context, our kōrero tuku iho, because kōrero tuku iho, which is Mātauranga that's been handed down, now that therefore has a whakapapa back to the knowledge that we trust, our parents, aunties, uncles, their parents, their aunties, uncles, back to our tipuna and so on. So this has deep relevance for us as Māori. So those are some of our early learnings. I'm going to just discuss the survey itself. At this stage, I want to acknowledge Sean Ogilvie. He might be in the audience, I'm not sure. But e mihi ana ki aia. So he extracted some of the key findings from this part of the report, and so I'm just talking to some of his points. So the 5 areas of questions of their role around Mātauranga revolved around again policy regarding Mātauranga legislation, public funding, how we supporting communities, indeed Māori communities, iwi communities. We know that increasingly so, iwi are engaging in the education and research space, and the protection of data is really at the top of their priority. And I'll explain a bit about my experience of that towards the end of the presentation. Any programs or any projects that each of these departments are undertaking regarding Mātauranga, indicators or monitoring regarding Mātauranga, and again going back to the self-assessment, we asked the government departments to give them an honest assessment from 1 to 5 of where they might sit, and so we've numbered them 5 at the top. So as we'll see, again, we're not judging here. This is just the information that we got given, and we're just sharing this with you now. So I'll just go through some of those, and if any of those resonate with you, then you'll see. And this again is in the report. Okay, right. So I'm gonna let you read that. You don't need me to read it for you. But basically, it doesn't look positive from the survey. But the purpose is to look forward to find what this data and how this data might inform next steps or the future ways of advancing Crown agency support for mātauranga. So a part of the report, as well as active protection, what does that actually look like? The Crown's role in mātauranga. There can be no doubt that te reo and mātauranga Māori are highly valued and irreplaceable taonga for New Zealand. These taonga exist nowhere else. The Crown has a duty to actively protect these taonga. In the report, some of the idioms used in the Tribunal's report, such as Crown control of mātauranga, enshrined in Chapter 6 of Ko Aotearoa Tēnei, and the title of this report, while provocative, are not useful for clarifying what the Crown's role should be. The role should be about providing active protection, not control. What does that look like? Policies developed to control are fundamentally different from those developed to actively protect. So it's a shifting of the lens and the dial. And I guess the key message here is we want to interrogate what is an understanding of what does active protection look like? I'm trying to rush now. Okay. So it could look like provide clarity and direction to Crown and Māori, enable the Crown to proceed in a deliberate rather than an ad hoc manner, as it is presently. Provide transparency and accountability of government resourcing priorities and expenditures. Enhance Māori exercise of mana motuhake and kaitiakitanga in relation to Māori biocultural heritage. Enable the use of relevant mātauranga for the benefit of te taiao. Help foster an inclusive, respectful New Zealand society. Enable more informed Crown positions in relevant international negotiations. I am just going to carry on maybe for 1 minute, Maui, if that's okay, because the last point is why Māori should control these things, and this is why. So this is our research project up in Pawarenga, National Science Challenge project. We are very clear that anything that we do and engage with the whānau from Pawarenga is led by Pawarenga. In fact, the first conversation that we had with Jo Murray, if anyone knows Jo Murray, she's on the right-hand side with the glasses in the poncho. It was about, now circling back to the kaupapa of our hui, data sovereignty and the governance of that. And we are very clear that all the mātauranga lies with, and the governance and ownership of the mātauranga lies with the community. And so we are partnering with them to also ensure that their aspirations are met as well. And in this photo here, there are 4 generations of kōrero tuku iho being a part of this kaupapa. There are a couple of our other researchers who's Nova Paul, so Mihiana Kiaya, and Dawson Clutterbuck as well. They're probably behind the camera. But again, just being very clear that this is why it's important. They are the experts of their localized mātauranga. They are best equipped to lead and guide the preservation of their mātauranga. So how can Crown, how can universities, CRIs, how can we empower Māori experts to lead in this domain? It's not only a matter of cultural respect and recognition, but also ensures the kōrero tuku iho, the integrity, the accuracy, the transmission, and the authenticity of mātauranga Māori is kept intact, that integrity of knowledge. And there's no one better than the people from which the mātauranga comes from. We need to ensure that our decisions regarding mātauranga Māori are made by the communities themselves. And yeah, you know, that's really important. So just a bit about our project, where it's capturing soundscapes and so on. There's our sonic station, and it's about Cody Mati or Cody dieback, and just replaying healthy soundscapes back to Cody with that are unwell at the 528 sound healing frequency, using tohora sounds, taku taku, karakia, pūrākau, maramataka, ngā kaupeka o te tau. So these different layers of understanding are all from the Pawarenga and Te Rarawa community. So again, this goes back to, it's essential that we protect actively their mātauranga. So yeah, nō reira, ka anui ki au i tēnei wā, mō taku takaroa hoi no e mihi ana ki a koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Nā koe Valence, nami ki a koe, mō ira o ngā whakaro. Hoping that you might be able to put in the chat the link to that report so people can access it. But I do just want to remind people they can add their questions into the chat as well. And I'm just going to hand over to Tahu Kukutai to talk about data governance and sovereignty. He's an expert in the area. So kia ora Tahu.
Kia ora koutou, mihi kawana ki ngā kaiarahi o te Wānanga mo te rānei, ki a koe Holden, koutou ko Maui, ko Mempreet, ki aku hō mahi tēnā kōrua, ki a koutou kua hui mai, tēnā koutou katoa, ko waiau, he uri tēnei no Ngāti Tipa, Ngāti Kino Haku, Ngāti Māhanga te o Pōuri, ko Tahu Kukutai tōku ingoa. Ke te whare Wānanga o Waikato ahau e mahi ana, me ngā pai o te māramatanga hoki. Nō reira, tēnā rā koutou katoa. Good to see everyone online. Can you hear me okay? Oh, I can hear somebody else in the background. I'm just going to keep talking over them. Ka pai. So I will try very hard to keep to 15 minutes to allow sufficient time for Linnell to speak. Thank you for inviting me to give a paku kōrero today around the Māori data governance model. Before I do that, I just want to acknowledge the people that I worked with on this model from Taha Māori. That's Kiriko Whaimekaere, who's a head technician for Te Kahawira Raunga, Donna Cormack, Aroha Mead, who also worked on the previous report. She's a very busy and wise woman. Caleb Moses, Kyla Campbell Kamareira, and Jessie Whitehead, my colleague here at Te Ngira. I'm not speaking on behalf of Te Kahawira Raunga today. It's just me, but I just want to talk about the model and just give some people some insight into its background and what we're trying to achieve with it. Look, I don't have time to go into the backstory. There's a really big backstory to the model, but I think it's important to understand some of the wider global context and some of the conversations that are being had. So beyond Aotearoa, there's increasing recognition of the importance of Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance. This includes recognition in the UNESCO recommendations on the open science and the Research Data Alliance adoption of the CARE principles, which Maui worked on with our colleagues. I think one of the more surprising but significant areas where this has received attention is the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Privacy, in two reports, one relating to big and open data and the other on the use of personal health data, and has made some very strong endorsements of the need for not only governments, but also private sector and corporations to recognise the inherent sovereignty of Indigenous peoples over data about them or collected for them, and acknowledging that data are a cultural, strategic and economic resource. So I think that's a really important statement, and I always sort of keep that in mind when I'm doing my local work as well, that there's a much broader context to these conversations. So the Māori data governance model has been part of a phased approach that's been undertaken over a number of years now. I'm not sure whether the definitions have been discussed in previous Wānanga, so I'll just assume that people don't know what Māori data is. It's helpful to define definitions, I think. And so Māori data refers broadly to digital or digitizable data, information or knowledge that is about, from or connected to Māori. So this includes data about population, place, culture and environment. The model itself was published in May of this year, but it was a couple of years in the making. Phase 1 involved a very extensive consultation with Te Ao Māori, but also with the Kāwanatanga as part of the Mana Orite agreement, relationship agreement between the National Iwi Chairs Forum, Data Iwi Leaders Group, its operational arm, Te Kāhui-Rāraunga, and Stats New Zealand as the system leader for data. So there was very extensive consultation and then moved into phase 2, which was the actual model development itself. It was intended at the beginning to be a co-design process, but it became obvious fairly early on that a more efficient and probably effective process would be for those who work in the Māori data sovereignty and governance space, that is taha Māori, to develop the model, and for those involved in the Crown agencies to do what they do best, which is look across their system and look at the opportunities and the barriers to the implementation of the model. So that's sort of how we proceeded. We did this, we were a small rōpū, like I said, there was only 6 of us. We designed it entirely by Zoom, so it was a virtual process. And one of the things that we were really fortunate to be able to do was to meet regularly with the First Nations data governance strategy team. FNIGC were like the original data sovereignty warriors, really. They've been 20 years doing this. And they received a $70 million investment from the Canadian government to commence phase 1 of their own regionally based First Nations data centres. So it was just really incredibly valuable to have that Indigenous to Indigenous engagement, support and insight. And phase 3 is really where we're moving to in the future. If I've got time, I'll speak very briefly to that. And that's really where sovereignty lies. And I think it's really important to pause and distinguish between governance of Māori data, which is what the model is about, and data for Māori governance. So the governance of Māori data at the top is what our model focuses on, and more specifically, it focuses on the governance of Māori data across government agencies and trying to shift the system to be tiriti-led. And at the bottom is data for Māori governance. And this is largely outside the scope of the model, but it's where things need to shift. And that is investment in iwi, hapu, and Māori data infrastructure that sits outside the architecture of the government. And, it makes sense for a range of reasons to have more distributed, decentralized data systems that are closer to community to power local decision-making. You can think in the context of climate change, for example, why this is important, and mātauranga as well. And that's really the sovereign space, and that's the space that we need to move to. So this is a high-level snapshot of the model, and I'll just break down the key components really quickly. I can see I've got another maybe 8 minutes left. At the bottom as well is the link. So the model was published by Te Kāhui-Rāraunga as part of the Mana Orite agreement, and you can download it from their website. And if you're nice, they might send you a hard copy, but I believe most of them have gone. So if someone was to ask, how does Māori data governance make a difference? We should be able to point to the desired outcomes and say, these are the ways. It's not just data for data's sake. So the desirable outcomes really sort of describe the states that the model should contribute to if it's implemented with the right structures and the support and the resourcing. Oops, sorry. And you can see those on the right-hand side there. So the desired outcomes really support the National Iwi Chairs Forum's sort of 5 priority domains, especially Pou Tangata, which is around people, Pou Tāhua, which is around the economic realm, and as well as the government's wider focus on lifting wellbeing vis-a-vis the living standards and Te Ara Wai order. And you can also see here around supporting whānau to flourish and reaffirming and strengthening our connections to identity, place, and te reo Māori. So it's really about shifting that system so that we can realise our own, self-determining outcomes as a people. So the values are expressed, these 5 values that underpin the model and are integrated throughout. We deliberately express them in English to avoid confusion with the uaratanga that guide the Mana Orite agreements, and to be readily sort of accessible to target users within the public service. But also, you know, let's be frank. I mean, there's so many tangas around the public service now that we do not really need any more. And it was really good that, you know, Aroha Mead was like, just, you know, let's use language that people are going to understand when they're implementing the model. So nurture data as a taonga. Valence was talking about taonga in the context of mātauranga. You know, is really important because data are often described as the world's most valuable resource, you know, a commodity to be extracted and used and reused. But by contrast, Māori data, you know, is a taonga. It requires active protection and careful nurturing for the benefits of individuals and collectives, both now and in the future. Be accountable. You know, data is relational. All data come from somewhere or someone. And with that relationships comes responsibilities and accountabilities. And those who hold, I'm not going to say kaitiaki, those who hold Māori data must be willing to be held to account and to be answerable for the decisions and actions that are taken. I won't go through all the values, but I will just, you know, finish with put iwi Māori data in iwi Māori hands. So there's no point in having a Māori data governance model if the data does not end up in the hands of the people from whom it came. You know, and this really requires agencies to implement a Māori definition of what Māori data is, to understand and uphold the relationships that connect Māori to Māori data, to resource the technologies that enable the transfer of Māori data back to Māori, and to remove the barriers and prevent us from accessing and using our own data. So yeah, I'll leave that for the values and I'll move on. The report, which is 70 pages, has a whole section on authority, and it's really, really important because this will likely require some form of legislative change and certainly policy change, because without meaningful authority, there's a real risk that the model will be sort of diluted to a voluntary framework. And we've been doing some separate mahi with Linnell, you know, on this. And one of the things of talking to the FNIGC in Canada was they clarified the powerful lever that they now have available to them through the UN DRIP Act to give really meaningful effect to data sovereignty. We don't have that here at the moment. It's really assertions. And so there's a lot of work to be done in this authority space. And there's a range of recommendations made in the report in terms of policies, processes, and practices, and resourcing to really give effect there. So these are the data po. They're really the building blocks that represent priority areas of action and against which government agencies can assess their Māori data governance maturity level. And each of these po defines a critical area of data governance and specifies a set of directives about the actions and processes and activities that agencies should be doing. It's really the practical how-to. It's nice to have a framework, but if you don't give people any guidance on what to do with the framework, nothing happens. That tends to be that's in my experience. So you need to give people more than a pretty framework. So this po includes data capacities and workforce development, data infrastructure, data collection, protection, data access, sharing, and yes, repatriation, data use and reuse, data quality and system integrity, and data classification. And each of these po has a dedicated section in the model because it's 70 plus pages. Briefly, just to give you an example, this is po 2 data infrastructure, and it covers sort of data consumption, storage, and sharing. And there's a number of key priorities and actions in there because it doesn't cover everything. Otherwise, it would be like a 700-page report. So, strategic prioritization has occurred. So one of those areas is the data infrastructure that actually works for Māori. Another one is around distributed and decentralized data infrastructure. And the third one is really about having data infrastructure that's sustainable and future focused. And I don't have time to delve into the detail, but that gives you a little taster. And we also throughout the model have a number of examples, which are often poor examples, but also exemplars to really give people and agencies a concrete sort of concretize the sorts of things that we're talking about. So one of the examples or exemplars, the good examples for data infrastructure is Te Whata. So some of you may be familiar with Te Whata. The URL is at the top there. And so it's a web-based data platform designed and operated by Te Wānanga and built by private sector consultants that provides access to aggregated data sets for the 100+ iwi and iwi-related groups in the iwi classification. At the moment, it's mainly people data, and it's the public-facing portal contains a really easy-to-navigate dashboard of indicators, but it also allows iwi information managers to log in and customize the data to align with their own strategies and goals, and to write reports and narratives that reflect their own specific priorities and circumstances, but that's available only to the iwi. You know, sometimes the devil's in the detail, and what happens a lot is there's a massive implementation gap. And so, you know, frameworks and policies and processes and so forth are designed, and no one ever implements them, so you don't get any of the sort of desirable outcomes that you're seeking. So one of the things that we've been working on after the model design is a sort of a template for implementation. This one here hasn't been published yet, so I've just got a brief snapshot, but you can see here that it's has some assessment criteria, not met, partially met, and met, as an extra tool to help agencies understand some of the ways in which they might go about implementing and assessing the model in their own context. So I'm almost out of time. Look, I'm just going to end by saying, you know, this is where I think really the big opportunity is. I've talked about the Māori data governance model. Hopefully you'll all be able to download it and read it for yourself and use it in your own context. But I think really the big opportunity for Māori is moving into the space, which is, you know, data for Māori governance, and really just understanding what are the critical steps towards a mana motuhake data system. What are the responsibilities? What are the opportunities that agencies can tap in to help shift us in that direction? And I think the next couple of years will be really interesting and exciting to see what we can achieve in this space. And that's all from me. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Kia ora, tēnā koe tahu. Yes, so feel free to keep adding your questions to the chats, and I'm just going to hand it straight on to Linnell. Kia ora, Linnell. You're on mute. Sorry.
Tēnā koe Māui o tira, tēnā koutou katoa, e hui hui mai nei, tautoko ngā mihi kua mihia, ki ngā atua, ki ngā mate, ki ngā tangata whenua, kia koutou katoa. Ko waio, he uri tēnei no te Aotearoa, ko Ngāti Rune, Ngā Ruhine, Ngā Rauru, Ngā Iwi, ko Linnell Tawhiri Huria tōku ingoa, ko au tētahi o ngā tumuaki o Kāhui Legal. Tēnā koutou. Kia ora, it's lovely to be here. Thank you for having me. I do feel, after hearing the last two presentations, mine might be a bit of a step backwards to kind of analyse, have a look at how the intellectual property system interacts with these issues around data, data governance and data sovereignty. And I hope that screen is showing correctly. If someone could give me the thumbs up, that would be cool. Awesome. Thank you. So I'm going to jump to the intellectual property system first, because this is the area that I work in, but also it's really important to provide context perhaps to some of the conversations that have happened in the two previous presentations. So the intellectual property framework is one that we've inherited from overseas. It's an Anglo-European US framework that was really developed and gained a lot of strides during the Industrial Revolution. The idea was that we needed to create more, we needed to build more, we need to produce more, and that created, you know, more wealth, created more jobs, provided more for the world as a whole. And intellectual property was a tool to support industry, enable them to continue to produce more and do so without fear that their products would be copied or stolen or misused as they embarked on these on their own industrial journeys. Part of the goals of the intellectual property framework is to support innovation. One of the arguments is that it encourages innovation because it provides a monopoly over an invention or a new creation that enables the creator to generate wealth or gain wealth from that investment that they've made into that new invention or new creation.
And now we're just seeing, we're not seeing your presenter mode.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that good?
Yep. Perfect.
That's again awesome. Okay. So I was talking about innovation. So intellectual property provides a monopoly to inventors to enable them to utilize that monopoly and, you know, get a return on their investment in the R&D and that or the creation of that new invention. As production grew, those companies wanted to ensure that when they wanted to sell their products overseas in other countries, they wanted to ensure that they had the same protections that they had in their home countries, in the countries that they went into internationally. So as globalization occurred, we started to see free trade agreements or trade agreements being developed, and those trade agreements including minimum requirements for the intellectual property framework. And one of the key agreements that informed New Zealand's intellectual property framework is the TRIPS agreement, which resulted in New Zealand becoming a part of the World Trade Organization, and it established pretty much the intellectual property framework that we have in Aotearoa, New Zealand at this present time. So what the intellectual property framework does is it establishes these intellectual property rights, which, like I said, grant monopolies over inventions, enable entities or organizations or individuals to exploit those inventions, and then they can get a return and maintain competitive advantage, stop others from using that invention, and create income and wealth as a consequence. These rights grant exclusive ownership over those rights, and they exclude those inventions from what we call the public domain. The public domain being the area where if anything falls into the public domain, then it's basically free for anybody to use. And these frameworks, as I mentioned, have strong protection under national laws, not just here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but also internationally. And so this framework has led to a number of issues and has resulted in a lot of misuse of our taonga. And I'm just going to show a few examples. There's actually quite a few, but I'll try and rush through them quite quickly because we only have a short amount of time. We have here a New Zealand company who applied koru designs to their shoes. This was like back in the 80s or 90s. This was, I've seen shoes designed by Māori featuring these designs more recently, but in the 80s or 90s, this was considered quite offensive. As a consequence of objections, their use was withdrawn, and they stopped producing these shoes. Moana Maniapoto, a well-known famous example of her travelling to overseas, into Europe, into Germany in particular, being served with a cease and desist letter. She wasn't able to promote her concert tour or her tour in that country because the other party owned a monopoly over the name Moana and or owned an intellectual property right over that name and could stop her from promoting her tour there. These are a range of cars produced by Mattel, featuring a couple of designs, but in particular a heitiki on the bonnet, on the hood, and an inappropriate use of one of our important icons, our taonga, in an inappropriate way. The Lego series, the Bionicle series, that adopted and used a number of names including tohunga and some of our atua names like Pangaroa, and without consent, without any approvals, and that was objected to by Māori, and they were that product was, or they agreed to stop using those names. We have another New Zealand company here using the story and narrative of Hinimoa and Tūtanikai on their beer product, and again being able to, they filed trademark applications for these logos. They eventually withdrew those applications because of the bad publicity or adverse publicity that they received. But effectively, our intellectual property laws permit this to happen. This is a Belgian company, Māori Tears. Again, it's not just the word Māori being used on beer, but also the narrative around roimata and how that cleanses. There's a cleansing process that we understand that occurs when you do cry. That narrative was used as part of the sale of these products. These are some of our rangatira, our tupuna, who are in the form of decanters, alcohol being inside these statues and being marketed internationally. Patents threatening to misappropriate Māori knowledge, like Manuka. These are more recent images of digital copies. This is a painting of an individual made without their permission and attempted to be sold. An NFT being sold, again representing Māori. In 2005, National Geographic undertook the Genographic project in an attempt to collect DNA samples from Indigenous peoples all across the world to track migratory patterns. Eventually, this project has stopped because of the objections and concerns about the potential use of that data. And then lastly, more recently, we've seen a lot of rhetoric around the use of facial recognition technology and the fact, the embedded racist accounts, racism that's embedded into that technology and AI. So while all of this is, these examples of words and images and names and logos and data, there's, if you think about it, these are all data in some way. They're recorded in data or digitizable in some way, and so therefore they fall into the broader category of data. So our intellectual property laws enable this all to happen, and it's actually, this has been going on not just in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but around the world for Indigenous peoples. So Y262 was the claim that was filed in response to the concerns about the intellectual property framework. And this is one of the original claims that was made in that claim, and that New Zealand had agreed to these international agreements, which I spoke about earlier, that affected Indigenous flora and fauna and the intellectual property rights and rights to other taonga. And I've sort of explained, you can see how this framework, these frameworks have affected our ability to control use of our taonga and prevent inappropriate use of our taonga, particularly in the examples that I gave. At this particular point in time, there was not a lot of data sovereignty. Those terms and data governance were not terms talked about when the claim was filed back in 1991. But if you think about for Te Ao Māori, the physical and the metaphysical are totally interrelated. And so whilst it does primarily focus on the physical, the metaphysical sits alongside it, and intrinsically sits alongside that. So some of the key themes that came out of the report was that it was necessary to protect our culture and identity, and in my view, that automatically extends to data. because that is how we protect New Zealand's culture and identity. Whilst in making this statement, I do think that the report is trying to appeal to not just Māori, but also, all of New Zealand, to implore that this is important to all of us. It's not just for Māori, it's important to all of us to actively protect our Māori culture, and that our law should make room for relationships between kaitiaki and the taonga works, taonga species, and mātauranga Māori, and not just make room for those relationships to exist, but make room for those relationships to flourish, and to flourish because that's a matter of national interest. So again, really trying to appeal to the broader public, but also imploring on us that it's not just about maintaining, it's actually making sure that those relationships are flourishing and flourishing at a good level. So in summary, what the report said was our laws do not protect kaitiaki rights and interests. We can protect aspects of mātauranga Māori through the IP system, so we can file trademark applications for kupu Māori, for Māori images. We can get copyright over copyright works, but that protection that the IP system provides is not sufficient for mātauranga Māori to flourish. And so other structures and regimes need to be established. So I'm not going to go through all the regimes and structures that report proposed, but I thought I would go on and talk about another claim, the Y2522 claim, which sort of was looking at data in particular, and what the claimants were seeking from the tribunal was recognition that Māori data is a taonga, recognition that digital ecosystems have mauri, mana and whakapapa, and so that also requires active protection, and that even though anonymised data exists, it still carries whakapapa and therefore remains Māori data, and so therefore is a taonga and therefore needs protection under the principles of active protection apply because it is a taonga. And the conclusions made by the tribunal in that report is it didn't necessarily say that data was a taonga, but it did say that mātauranga Māori is a taonga, or reaffirmed that mātauranga Māori is a taonga. And in those situations where Māori data is a component of mātauranga Māori, then then it is a taonga, and therefore the active protection principles apply. There were concerns about the digital governance and digital regulation, and acknowledged that this has implications for the integrity of mātauranga Māori. So unless there are proper rules and regulations in place for in that digital environment, then there is a risk to mātauranga Māori, and therefore the parties, or the Crown and Māori, need to get together to discuss what are the new policies and structures that need to be put in place to support and ensure that mātauranga Māori and our taonga is protected. So just to quickly summarise, sort of the points that I've just talked to, the sort of bottom line approach, the IP approach, is that data falls into this public domain unless there is some other restriction, unless there is some sort of IP right over it, or some other legislative framework will apply. And the one that we do know of or that exists, is that personal information is protected by our privacy laws. As a consequence of data falling into this public domain, it's easy for organisations to aggregate data and extract value from data, including from that aggregated data. And it's really easy for organisations to ignore Indigenous perspectives. And that's why we need other frameworks like the one that Tahu just talked about as well. So some of the things I think should be within an Indigenous rights-based approach for data, there definitely needs to be protocols. There needs to be protocols about who has access to the data, There needs to be information shared about why the data needs to be accessed and what the data is going to be used on. How is that access going to be gained? And for how long is that access needed? And then where is that access to that data going to happen? And that talks a little bit to data sovereignty in particular. And this is my last slide, so I think I'm within time. But one thing in some of the work that you're doing when you're accessing data, or whether you're providing access to data, it's really important for you to make sure that the access and use is consistent with whakapapa. So, who has the relationship to that data? So who should be involved in the decision related to that data, and are you working with that party as you access and use that data? Has there been an acknowledgement or attribution to that third party and acknowledged their relationship? Have you respected kaitiaki relationships? Have you obtained free, prior and informed consent? And for that access, is there some form of benefit sharing? And I think, those are sort of more broader concepts that sort of sit behind the framework that Tahu has just described and support, that's a more advanced discussion of what I've talked about here. So that's me. I will stop sharing, and tēnā koutou katoa.
Korula now, that's great. Thanks for that. I see the questions are starting to roll in, and I see some answers going in there. So let's keep that continuing. So it's been really great to get a kind of a feel for some of the big context that's operating in New Zealand around issues of data governance and data sovereignty. And I'm just going to hand it over to Holden to talk a little bit more from a Manaaki Whenua point of view, the sorts of conversations they've been having as part of their Te Tiriti Partnership Group. Kia ora, Holden.
Yeah, kia ora, Maui, o tira kia ora koutou katoa. Look, I feel a little bit daunted as the Crown agent sort of giving the kōrero after those three very, very, very good contributions. But I will sort of just give a quick overview of some of the initiatives that are going on in the CRI space, at least. So one thing that's happening in the CRI space, and look, none of this is about the end point. It's kind of, these are first steps on a journey, if you like, towards greater Māori control of Māori data. Because as you know, Crown Research Institutes sit on a lot of Māori data. But one thing that's happening in the CRI space is there is a cross-CRI initiative to develop principles to recognise Māori data governance. And I understand that initiative is looking to engage with iwi Māori putanoi te motu around just how those principles might apply in the CRI sector. So that's one piece of work that's going on in the CRI space. Another one, just real quickly, is Manaaki Whenua in particular has established a Te Tiriti Partnership Group for our collections and databases, chaired by Dr. Aroha Mead. So to your point, Tahu, she's a very busy woman, and but we've met a couple of times now, and that group was kind of an attempt to move more towards Māori oversight and control of our collections and databases. We haven't really reached that point yet, but certainly they've provided a lot of really useful input and advice into our strategic plan for our collections and databases, which we're rolling out now. One aspect of that strategic plan was the appointment of a kaitū honohono or connector role, and that role was recommended by the TTPG, and the sole focus of that position is to help connect whānau hapuaniwi to the taonga that we hold from their rohe in our biological collections. Another initiative that we've sort of taken a first step into is we've attached to all of the metadata for our specimens and the physical collections that we hold biocultural notices. So these notices basically let anyone who's accessing the specimens know there may be Indigenous rights and interests associated with those specimens, and further, exploration of what those rights and interests look like might need to be had. So it's kind of a first step, and 3 iwi so far have also attached biocultural labels to the specimens from their specific rohe. So that's kind of a first step that Manaaki Whenua has also taken. Another area we're working in, and this is kind of a new space that I've been involved in, is around providing free geospatial awareness training to all pre- and post-settlement governance entities who are interested in that GIS kind of area. We do see that GIS, kind of geospatial awareness, as an opportunity to help make the data that we hold more visible to whānau Hapuaniwi. So we're offering that training at a no-cost basis to Hapuaniwi organisations. I'll probably leave it there at this point and hand it back to you, Maui.
Kia ora. Thanks for that, Holden. I see someone has their hand up. If we can just hold off on those hands for a bit and just keep adding your items to the chat. Also, I know that Tahu has to kind of drop off shortly, so we'll allow her to go. If you get a quick question in the chat, she may be able to answer it before she exits. But I think what we've seen so far is both the broader context, but then how that's starting to drop into into certainly the CRI space and where those collections and things sit. So I've just got a few slides to add to the mix before we go into the Q&A session. And that's also really just to show some of the conversations that have happened so far, not only around the, there we go. Are you seeing the right slide as well? The right view?
Aye.
Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, so I just want to really highlight some conversations that have already happened around exploring Māori data governance and sovereignty in this context of eDNA. So really thinking about how we take on board the sorts of ideas and things that have been shared and the principles that are emerging in a kind of a broader context, and think about how it might relate to this project that's been around building this business case for a Te Tiriti-guided national barcode reference library. But also just letting people know that it's not only this project, but there's other sorts of projects that are doing similar kinds of activities, maybe not at a national level, and maybe not thinking about it for all New Zealand's biodiversity, but just around particular areas. And it's in a similar thing, thinking about eDNA monitoring and the resources required to support that, to make that effective as an approach. And so just to give a little bit of an idea, that there's the bit along the bottom really talks about the collection from the environment and what needs to happen with those samples and information that gets generated, and how that then needs to be matched up with other things that have gone on. And so up the top part where you see kind of vouchered specimens, which is just really saying that these are specimens which have kind of been quality controlled and checked to know that they relate to the thing you're talking about, and that the DNA associated with those is there sitting in the background as a part of the library. And when other samples come in, they get checked against it, and then you can work out, which species is which species. So you have these different sorts of activities and functions that are related to each other, but often happen sort of independent of each other. And there may be, different sorts of permissions and consultation required to do the collections around each of those different activities. But as those activities are generated, or as the activities that collect those samples are generated, when they're collected, how does governance sit around the entities and how those resources are then used, particularly when they're sort of moving into something that sits as a reference library. And so what I just wanted to kind of share is some of the thoughts that have emerged from the conversations we had a month ago, and how they've been linked to things that are happening before. And it's kind of great. It'll be sort of nice to see how much of an overlap this has with the information that's been shared so far as well. So what would a framework for the ethical operation of a DNA reference library, or what could it look like? There need to be some guiding principles. I'm just using the ones that we put together as part of the Te Tiriti-guided guidelines around research with genomic research with Tonga species. But these can be amended. There's really thinking about the sorts of conversations that people have had. And even though the entry point into the conversations at the moment is around data governance and sovereignty, often it's actually about those relationships and how people get to participate in, and what does that look like in a general sense. And Holden talked about the role in Manaaki Whenua and the relationship building that needs to happen, but also what kinds of permissions are required, whether those are consents, whether they're sorts of acknowledgements, the sorts of things that allow the activity to move forward, but they're agreements from people. And then how it relates in the kind of the data space around what sorts of things are being recognized in the systems as part of the metadata, in terms of IP recognitions and what that might mean for licensing and with the way access and restrictions are put in place, and whether or not labels are used. And then the component that's around use and really sort of sharing the knowledge, and whether that's being disseminated and the way in which that goes about, and what sorts of capacities can be built to allow and enable Māori to be a greater part of that system in the ways which they want to. And so this is sort of started to think about this, and you'll see the kind of traffic light thing there, which is very much like the framework that Tahu was describing with the Māori data governance model and their implementation component. But just as a way of thinking, what things have been established and put in place, what things are in development, and what stuff still needs to be done. But getting a sense of what that might look like. And in particular, these elements around Māori governance and Māori data sovereignty. And then actually, I think the last bit pushes into what Tahu had mentioned as well, that shift from not just thinking about the governance of data and where it is, but how it's being used. And how can we make use of that data to inform our decisions? What sort of platforms can we enable and create with that as well? And so this is just a little bit of a sort of some initial thoughts, which are really born out of the things that we've heard people say were important, and hopefully also reflect the things that we've heard earlier on today through the different talks. I did do a little bit of a sort of a triangulation exercise with it, at least in terms of looking at the things that had been identified as important in the Māori data governance model, and then in some other work that had been looking at sort of issues that Indigenous communities bring up in relation to biodiversity records, and just to see whether all of these things were being reflected in the sort of the framework as it had been put together to date. So that's really all I wanted to say. I'm just having a little bit of a shameless plug at the end of this, just in thinking about capacity building. The summer internship for Indigenous Peoples Genomics in Aotearoa has just opened, so really inviting applications for Māori that want to get involved and participate and sort of upskill themselves around the genomic space. So with that, I'll stop sharing and really open the session up for the Q&A. Holden?
Yes.
Hey, Akwe.
Ka pai. Kia ora tātou. Kia ora Māui. Now, look, we've still got Tahu, Linnell and Valence on the call, so keep the questions coming in. I'm just going to go back and have a look through these to see if any have been not been answered yet. But Sarah, you might need to help me out here. Have we got any in there that haven't been answered yet in the chat?
I get there's one from Valence that may be more, which you already sort of touched on in your presentation. It was from Barry asking why no response from DOC when Section 4 is such an important part of the Conservation Act.
That would be speculation, but any speculation on that one, Valence?
I see Linnell giggling. We've had a discussion as to what that could be, given that DOC is I suppose one of our key stakeholders in protecting our natural resources, but we can't speak on behalf of DOC, so it probably would be inappropriate for us to share what our speculations might be.
It's a good question to ask though, because and Linnell, correct me if I'm wrong, but that Section 4 of the Conservation Act is one of the strongest Te Tiriti provisions in legislation in Aotearoa, as I understand it. The obligation is to give effect to the principles of Te Tiriti, which is quite a bit stronger than elsewhere in our legislation. But there you go.
Holden, actually, we've got a question from Mumpreet for Tahu, maybe quickly before she goes. Mumpreet, yes, did you want to come on and... Yeah.
Just ask away, Mumpreet.
Kia ora, Holden. Kia ora, Tahu. Just thinking about the global biodiversity framework and how they're currently undergoing quite a bit of work on digital sequence information and how that might be regulated, the genetic resources might be regulated more in a global manner. And I think there is some work within there around Indigenous rights and sovereignty, but I just wanted to hear your take on it and whether iwi Māori have been involved in that conversation thus far. And if not, then how does that have consequences for us in Aotearoa, New Zealand?
Yeah, look, so thanks, Manpreet. Big questions. I haven't actually been involved in any of the biodiversity conversations, and so I'm a little bit reluctant to sort of weigh in on a space where I haven't really been actively involved. I mean, data is such a huge area, and Indigenous data is such a vast space that you can only be across so many spaces at any given point. So I know that Maui and others from Aotearoa have been involved in those Aroha Mead, and then in the US there's a whole range, a pretty significant Indigenous community that's been involved in these conversations. So I guess I wouldn't want to say something that would sort of not align with the messages that they've been sending out to the community. I guess what I will say though is that just to go back to the slide that had that clear distinction between data governance and data sovereignty, I think people conflate these concepts often. It's one thing to have really good governance over Indigenous data, including biodiversity data, and underpinning that, I guess you need some sort of ontology as well to help make decisions around what data should sit exclusively within the ambit of control of Indigenous communities, what data can be sitting in other spaces, and what data you can have shared control over. So there's a range of conversations around that. But I think increasingly institutions or agencies, whatever the nomenclature is, that hold data, researchers, scientists, are getting somewhat comfortable with the idea of that the governance is important, and it's all sort of bound up with ethics as well, and how they operationalize governance that meets their responsibilities and accountabilities and all that sort of stuff. I think they're less comfortable with the conversation that this data may not belong in your hands. This data may belong elsewhere. They're tricky conversations to have, but they are necessary conversations, regardless of whether it's biodiversity data, whether it's people data, whether it's environmental data, whether it's around mātauranga. At some point, there needs to be a conversation about where should this data reside. I think I'll leave it at that. Maui, you look like you're ready to jump in.
Oh, yeah, look, I was just gonna say, look, there hasn't been a very good coordinated into the kind of process.
Yeah.
And so while there's been some people providing some input in, it hasn't been it hasn't been in a kind of in a coordinated way. I think there's a whole bunch of different priorities which the taumata whakapuma have been dealing with, which Te Tiriti-guided have been dealing with, and sometimes these things aren't sitting at the top of the list. I know one of my colleagues here at the Institute, Katie Lee, had been up to Montreal and has started getting involved in some of those conversations. From a government point of view, TPK and MFAT have been responsible for putting across the alt New Zealand, a kind of a New Zealand government point of view. And there's been little bits of input into trying to make sure that maintains, I guess, space for what might emerge from conversations around Y262 and other things. So it's not ideal for sure.
Ka pai, kia ora Maui. I'm conscious Tahu's got to take off shortly, but while we've still got all the other three, Tahu, Linnell and Valence, I'm going to ask my own question. So if there was one thing that a Crown agency could do to move more towards Māori control of Māori data, broadly speaking, what would that one thing be? I might put it to you first, Tahu, because I know you've got to shoot off at 11:30.
Well, I guess I always go back to the values, the 5 values. And for me, they're all really important. But the critical one, I think, is that one, putting iwi Māori data in iwi Māori hands. And there's obviously a number of steps that you have to go through to understand what does iwi Māori data mean. What do you mean by putting it in their hands? It's not just a conversation around access. Let people access the data. When you have something in your hands,
yep,
you care for it, you make decisions about it. There's the whole bundle of stuff that comes when you have it in your hands. So for me, if there's one thing that the agencies can do, it's keep that value in mind, try and find ways to enable that to happen. I don't know if there's a one size fits all. I mean, it's a nice thought that there's a kind of and I guess that was a sort of the ambition of the model, was to try and make it broad enough that it can speak to a range of agencies, but not so detailed that you end up with a driving manual that's so bespoke that it gets too detailed. It's finding that sort of sweet spot in between. So I do think there's some broad elements that are relevant to all agencies that they can dive into to honour that value of putting iwi Māori data in iwi Māori hands. But because context really matters, and agencies have different data sets,
yep,
they may have different imperatives, different mandates and so forth. There's work that will have to go on within different institutions to understand what that means in their own context. It can't just be a plug and play. At some level you have to do the work. And I guess what I find a little frustrating sometimes, I get all these emails, can you tell us what we should do? It's like, actually, there's quite a lot of thought went into the model, and then it's really for for those in the agencies, I think, or institutions, research institutions, whatever the entity is, to start working through it themselves and figuring out what makes sense. Yeah. So I don't know, is that an evasive answer? I don't think I came up with one smoking gun.
It's a good answer. I'm going to go to Valence next. Any whakaaro in that space? One thing that agencies could do?
Yeah, I agree. I'm glad that ko tēnā te kōrua Tahu, because that's also, I suppose that was the final message from my kōrua, which is it needs to be, iwi-led, community-led, whānau-led. That might look like resourcing iwi to control their mātauranga. What does that look like? Just going back to, increasingly rūranga, hapu iwi, have an interest in this space. So how can, from a Crown position of resourcing, support those aspirations for their mātauranga? Because we know that within those communities are kaitiaki tūturu. So providing safeguards and rights and responsibilities of kaitiaki. Equity as well, equitable resourcing. One of our one of our whānau every Saturday morning up in Kaitaia flea market holds a sausage sizzle just so she can get the resources to provide pane and rongoa for the mahi that she's doing up there. So, you know, when you think of things like that at the flax roots level of what's happening, I think we can do more. So again, going back to supporting Tahu's kōrero, which is Māori-led, community-led.
Kia ora, Valence. Lynelle, any other whakaaro there?
I completely tautoko too. Mine kind of went to the same position, although I had a slightly different, a different way of framing it, and I won't go there because I think Tahu summarised it beautifully. But I do think there's, you know, if you think about the Y262 report, you know, the government hasn't, it was deliberately an all across, you know, across government report. There hasn't really been an across government response, and it would be really good to have that and the framework set up and delivered across to inform all the mahi that the government does, and then like Tahu said, have models that can, you know, then the individual agencies can then apply in their specific mahi that they do. But until we have that, until there's partnership in the space, you know, it's just so difficult to implement these changes.
Yeah, just to add to that point too, Lynelle, I mean, you know, agencies, I know the CRIs are grappling with it, and we've got a degree of collaboration across the CRI space, but, you know, there really is a need for a all of government kind of push on this. Te Puni was driving it at one point, but I'm not sure where that's kind of landed. Others might have more intel than I do on that. I'm just looking at another question, looks like it's popped in there. Has any of this been, oh, sorry.
Sorry, yeah, hold on, I think you found the one I was just about to say.
Yeah. Has any of this been actively considered by the Crown as part of Te Tiriti-guided? We need to get funders on board and the science structures to recognise these issues. I don't know if anyone can answer that on this call. Anyone have intel on what's happening in the Te Tiriti-guided space?
Yeah, like I can give some input into that because I'm involved with Te Tiriti-guided from an MPI perspective. The process that's going through at the moment is too high level to be for these matters to be considered in that sort of detail. But Māori and Mātauranga are a key part of the overall changes in Te Tiriti-guided, so it may filter down into specific project areas. But at this stage, the national priorities have not been set for Te Tiriti-guided, and until they are, you can't incorporate these sorts of things until those have been set.
Oh, thank you. I'm not sure who that was speaking there.
That was Barry.
Oh, kia ora, Barry.
Kia ora, Barry. That's great. Just before I go, I just add onto the Te Tiriti-guided kōrero, is that we just recently wrote a paper analysing the 34 Māori submissions to Te Tiriti-guided, very comprehensive, well thought out submissions, and identifying some of the key themes that came through in there. Particularly now, as MB's established the independent panel, like as Barry said, to assess those high-level national research priorities, where most of the funding will go over the next 10 years if the direction of travel continues in the way that it's going. But one of the key things that came out of that analysis of the Māori submissions was actually around the need for active protection around mātauranga and Māori data sovereignty, and the mechanisms to actually give full effect to that within the transformed RSNI system. So, you know, those issues are very much front of mind. How they're going to end up looking, I guess, will be an interesting space to look at. And I'm very sorry I have to go, but I just want to say thank you for the wonderful questions, really engaged questions, things to think about, and thank you for the opportunity as well, Holden, Maui, and Manpreet to sit alongside Valence and Lynelle. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Kia ora Tahu, always a privilege.
Holden, if I could just add there, it's Lynelle here.
Absolutely.
I think that I also understand that the Te Tiriti-guided, you know, does prioritise mātauranga Māori, and it does require, or one of the reforms will seek to ensure that researchers have the competency to engage with Māori and te ao Māori and vice versa. And so that does mean those researchers that are engaging should be across all of the issues that we've raised today around data when they are engaging with Māori.
Oi, kia ora mō tēnā.
I feel like I have to jump in too now. I can't speak specifically to Te Ara Pairangi, although Māori staff at AUT of where my significant mahi is, we did put a submission in as to what we think should be happening in the CRI sector and the university sector. And one key area that I think also reconnects back to what's that one thing that Crown agencies can do, which is, you know, Māori-led, community-led, iwi-led kaupapa and protection over their own mātauranga, is the other side, or the flip side of that is educating ourselves. I'm going to put it in a way where, you know, Sarangi Nui Walker would tell us at varsity that Māori in education is like the canary in the mine shaft. Everyone's focused on the canary, whether it's surviving or not. And no one's looking at the conditions of the mine shaft. And so the conditions of the mine shaft, therefore, are everyone else. And so, therefore, how can we, you know, understanding that we all come into these conversations with good intent and want to do better and want to be better, how can we support that? How can we do that through education? How can we do that through something as simple as treaty training and an appreciation to the why and the how we are in this situation? I know it's a big thing to say to some to relinquish power and authority of, I suppose, control over mātauranga to iwi, but we have to understand that it was not ours to begin with. It should go back to iwi, and that's in line with tikanga. But before we can get to that space, we have to re-educate ourselves. That huge thing about positionality, about our power and privilege, and understanding that, and therefore giving us the freedom to be able to therefore take on board suggestions like ourselves saying, yeah, give the power and authority of mātauranga back to iwi.
Kia ora, Valence. I'm still trying to wrap my head around the analogy of being the canary in the mine shaft.
Well, I often actually align that with the te rito o te harakeke, right? So everyone's focused on the harakeke, but what about the conditions of the soil? Is the soil nutrient rich? And if it's not, then the harakeke is going to die anyway. And where's the bellbird going to sing? It'll probably find another harakeke.
Yeah. Kia ora, iwa. Ka pai. All right. Well, I'm just looking and I see there's any further questions coming through, Sarah. I can't see any.
There's a couple of sort of related, a comment from Fina and a comment from David that is sort of a side issue with this is sometimes iwi lack the infrastructure or resourcing for this, and generally from David, generally data systems and data infrastructure receive insufficient investment in New Zealand. So how do we get government and the likes of MB with respect to science to invest more funding, which will need to be significant?
So how do we get MB to invest more to resource the iwi treaty partner in this kōrero? Any whakaaro on that one? Linnell, Valence, Maui?
Look, so not quite sure how to go about it. All I'm going to say is that there's actually a lot of resourcing required in terms of just sort of maintaining and developing data infrastructures.
Yeah.
So I know lots of places are kind of talking about those sort of ongoing needs to, you know, if you want to nurture data as a taonga, it requires a lot of kind of support and things to do that, to really shift it out of places where it's just being stored into places where it can be kind of used or put to use in different ways. And that's a challenge for institutions themselves. And then also for, of course, you know, for iwi to become more involved in that sort of activity. and then have the capacity to use it, because I think that's kind of one of the other things that, you know, I certainly noticed in sort of our context, that's sometimes we can get the information, but then being able to put it to use, whether that's through our archives or in other spaces, is another challenge as well. And I think there's sort of a tension between what seems to be happening in what I'd say national, international environment, where because of the expense, everything is aggregating up. And so it's not even institutions individually that can do that work, but they're having some sort of kind of other entity do it for them, which is sort of a pushing up. And at the same time, you know, from our point of view, we're trying to pull it back down and get it closer to iwi hapu kind of whānau as well. So all of those things are requiring resources, and it becomes a question about priorities there. And of course, Te Tiriti a Te Tiriti-led approach would say, let's prioritise the kind of Māori end of that spectrum.
Correct. Ka pai, oh, well, it sounds like, so the key theme, of course, is putting iwi Māori data into iwi Māori hands. And I think, Valence, you touched on this as well, and the way you phrased it was Māori control. You know, it's around moving that continuum from government kāwanatanga to tino rangatiratanga, effectively. Mana motuhake control of Māori data, I guess. I'm just kind of going to pause there to see any other questions there, Sarah.
Maybe one that Tahu did get a chance to briefly touch on it in the chat, but might be worth opening it up. John, are you still on the call? It was your question about what is the risk or opportunity of AI evolution, given the extensive data harvesting that has already gone on and will become more pervasive. If you're there, feel free to add or expand on that. Otherwise, I'll pass it back to you, Holden.
Any thoughts on that? The risks or opportunities in AI, Linnell, Valence?
Oh, I definitely think the same issues apply for sure. There's been, you know, it is the same model. If we think about IP and then we think about data, and now about AI, it is about extraction for value and for individual gain. And so the same issues apply. The same models need to be developed and applied in an AI context. And one of the good things I think I saw on LinkedIn the other day, somebody posted that they asked ChatGPT to translate a motetea, and it refused to, because it said that, you know, I can't remember the exact statement, but it was something like there are particular nuances about how that might be translated, and so it refused to translate it. So you can build those sort of protocols in, and it is protocols, and it can be done. So it's not hard to, but we do need to be aware that there are big risks. And I also kind of touched on that with the facial recognition technology that's being developed as well. You know, that's all AI based. There's big concerns about that. One of the arguments that I've encountered is that people will say, well, if we don't get the data to help inform AI, then it's never going to get better. But you can't kind of hold people hostage to that kind of requirement and require them to provide their data so that you can create a better AI system. You actually need to make sure that you have the right protocols in place in the first situation. So that's my thoughts.
Kia ora, Linnell. Anything to add there, Valence?
No, I think Linnell pretty much hit the nail on the head. I might circle back to Fina's question.
Sure.
I was thinking about it for a little while. It's not that iwi or hapu don't have an interest in this space. It goes back to what Fina said, which is we don't have capacity to be able to, or bandwidth to engage in this space. And so therefore, If that is the barrier, how do we enhance access or remove that barrier? And I think we're thinking too much like what can we do now for impact now. I think we should be thinking long term. I think we should be thinking about what does how might we engage rangatahi? How might we build capacity so that we, if we say that we want to be want Māori dance and Māori control, and if capacity is an issue, what kind of things can we put in place, all of us, to ensure that intergenerationally we are supporting hapu and iwi? And it might be, again, going back to an overarching policy where something like that features strongly in how we might create impact for iwi to be able to have control over their own mātauranga. So, yeah, just a whakaaro there.
Kia ora, Valence. I might leave it at those salient comments from Valence and pass it over to the very capable Manpreet at this point.
Kia ora, Holden. I just wanted to take this moment to just open it up to the group that are currently live. If there's any points, we do have still Valence and Linnell and Maui and Holden here and the panel. If anybody has any points they want to raise, any questions they want to raise about their own work, about how they've engaged with data sovereignty, what have been the difficulties or what have been the successes, we're keen to hear. Oh, and we have a hand up. Fantastic. Go on, Te Whare.
Hey, kia ora tātou. Nā mihi kia koutou. I'm in awe at who's on the screen today in front of me. I'm basically just starting to learn my way through this whole process, but the amount that's coming through to me is pretty overwhelming. I just want to share a couple of things, and it's Valence, your last kōrero, around how can we get more involved in terms of as Māori, not only Māori, but as community. So we do a little operation out of Nongataha. We layered things within our ngāhere around protection. We actually complained approximately 10 years ago around our land being dying and struggling to survive, and talking mainly around dock whenua. We've got a real passion that we basically, for my hapu anyway, as a trustee of my marae for 20 plus years, where we met every month, and we'd most probably only have 5 in attendance, and it's now growing quite considerably to today because of what we're doing. We found that we needed to bring our people home first and foremost. So keeping a tab on the ngāhere and how well it's been protected and looked after was the catalyst for that. We found that it wasn't being looked after very well, and it was relying on a lot of volunteers to do the job. So we basically put a proposal to government, and that was accepted, and we've basically created an element for us that's really taken us on a journey that we never thought we'd go to, and that's around the DNA process. But the main reason we did this was to bring our people home, to grow the capability and the capacity within, to grow the relationship within our community, because we lacked the capability and capacity. So the only way we could see this moving forward was to include everyone within our rohe to be involved. So we're sitting at a really nice space now. So we study bugs and insects. Those were basically our main ingredient, or the lower level of our whakapapa within the forest. And of course we met Manpreet and Steve from Canterbury University. We've done a little kōrero to it because we found a couple of bugs that in our view had never been discovered, but it created a huge amount of excitement with our people. We found one bug that was 220 million years old, so that makes us most probably one of the oldest tupuna within our country walking around in our forest. So 2 years on from that, we have trapped 150,000 hectares of whenua. to get rid of predators and pests. We sit under the Manaaki Koma Mamaku range. The good thing about this is we've started the journey. We have our challenges, because what we're finding is we're having to re-educate our people. And this is, when you brought that up, Valence, I thought, oh, well, I've got something to talk to now, because re-educating is actually the secret weapon. Not just our people, though. Re-educating our fellow tauiwi to understand the importance of us as Māori people and why we think the way we're thinking, why we think the treaty is very important, and why we need to be involved to advance this situation around us and grow it. And so pest eradication is what we do. We're on the ground, doing that mahi. But the ongoing monitoring is the biggest challenge that we're starting to face just after 2 years of being in this project. And we need to do eDNA alongside GMP. We need to do this because our numbers have not grown enough to be able to continue to look after our area. And we're having to struggle with invasions and stuff like that. That's really having an impact. So ongoing predator eradication is going to happen all the time. It's going to be every year for the next 20 years until they've actually gone. But re-invasion is our biggest challenge. So if we can learn this whole kōrero, share this template, whatever we're wanting to do, and bring on as many people and then bring them into the same kaupapa. But re-educating, hapu is the key. If you can get hapu, preferably before iwi, because you'll always find a hapu takes the lead, and then usually an iwi will come over the top. Those are the challenges we face. We've got those challenges within Te Aroa, and what that does is it takes away the energy and your focus just to deal with those little challenges, which are not really needed, to be honest. So it's just my little bit of an input. You must be going to hear a bit more from me as we go on.
That whole reconnecting, their re-educating and reconnecting is absolutely critical in this space, eh? Yeah. Kia ora mō tēnā.
Kia ora te pare. Really appreciate you coming on and saying a few words to inform us of how we can be useful and helpful in your journey with your whenua and your whānau as well. Tautoko to that. And okay, so I'm going to try and wrap us together and give a final wee summary and a little hint into the next steps moving into this, the final phase of this project. So let me quickly try to share my slides. Share screen, bear with me a moment. So we are now in the final moments of the Wānanga series, which has been such an exciting part of this project. But just to bring everyone back to the top, this is a National Science Challenge funded project where we had the main goal was to create space for gathering information, gathering knowledge on a variety of topics that we have got to discuss through this Wānanga series. Once again, very quickly, just the initial working group that started us out on this journey. And here's a list of the people who brought forth their knowledge, both technical and around Te Tiriti guidance that was provided to us by this group to first off identify these key topics that we needed to explore further. Just to give a very, very brief overview of what went through the Wānanga series, and those who joined us partway through this journey can find this information also on our website. Each of the videos will be available, is currently available. The last ones will be available shortly. But we started with reviewing what the users' reference libraries could enable, that included biodiversity monitoring, biosecurity monitoring, and just a range of useful tools like that communities could bring forth and utilize in their to reach their aspirations with their whenua, just as Te Poari just mentioned. We then explored how the data that is encoded within DNA can give effect also to whakapapa through understanding Māori perspectives on the use of the DNA-related data and how we need to be creating opportunities for protecting that and for securing these aspirations as well. Followed by looking at how database architectures and existing pathways can enable or limit these sorts of aspirations. Finally, we moved into a few more technical aspects around technologies that are currently existing and the advances that can enable us to develop these resources quickly and by involving more and more community members. And into looking at across the ditch and across globally what other projects have been doing that have been working with Indigenous rights and data sovereignty issues. Globally, we heard from projects in Aotearoa in Australia and Canada, as well as within New Zealand. And finally, to today's Wānanga, where we've heard some fantastic talks from Valens, from Tahu, from Holden, and of course from Linnell, who gave me like just the information I personally needed to understand the intricacies of the IP around it, and a nice wrap up from Maui as well on the ongoing discussions around specifically around data sovereignty and how that will inform our next steps moving into the development of a practice for the reference library project. Once again, all of these videos are recorded and available through this link, and we will be sending emails again to provide you with this information if you want to check out any of these past sessions. Now, where to from here? So it's been quite a journey. We're extremely grateful for everyone who's come along, including our speakers, including our facilitators, including the project working group, as well as all the participants who've come and talked to us and raised these issues and brought forth their thoughts and questions. Now, the one final thing we need from you is to participate in a feedback survey. So we are looking for feedback on how to do this better. But also we're looking for interest in this project. Now, there is still a bit of a work to do. And Kamai, Kapunga, and Te Pari particularly are helping us test some of these initial ideas, initial thoughts that are being developed through this Wānanga series into a working series of documents to enable the development of data sovereignty for the reference library that will be helping them generate specifically for their rohe to support the work in the invertebrate monitoring. But as this project grows, as we move towards a more national approach, we will be looking at other communities as well who might be interested in participating in this. So please fill out this survey that will be coming forth to you in the next set of emails, and give us an indication if you're interested through that. After that, the working group reconvenes to provide a final guidance on development of the business case. And then Holden and I, and hopefully with help from Maui and others, will have our nose to the ground developing the business case and submission of this advice to the government. So that's the remaining mahi that needs to be done towards this program. And with that, I just wanted to say ngā mihi nui to everybody who's participated thus far. And I would just like to invite Holden back on to close the hui and to close the Wānanga series with a karakia. Thanks.
Kia ora, Manpreet. O tira, kia ora koutou katoa, ka nui te mihi anō kia koutou I pono mai ki tēnei kaupapa whakahirahira. Me pēnei pēr te kōrero kua rangatira, katoa tātou I tā koutou taitanga mai ki te whakatutuki I ngā wawata kei mua ia tātou I tēnei wā mō tēnei kaupapa whakahirahira. Nā reira, tēnei te mihi atu ki a koutou katoa, ngā kaikōrero, Linnell, Tahu, hakoa kua wehe atu koe, Valence, Maui, Manpreet, tātou katoa me ki, nā reira hei whakakapi I tō tātou hui, ka taki nei he paku karakia. Nā reira, Kia taunga manaakitanga a te mea ngaro ki runga ki tēnā o tātou. Kia mahea te hua mā kihi, kia toi te kupu, toi te mana, toi te aroha, toi te reo Māori, kia tūturu ka whakamaua kia te ina. Haumie, hui e tā iki. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora.
Wā.
Kia ora.
You.